our participants in on the chat today. As you come into the chat, just remember we've got a Q&A button. So if you've got any questions for us during the chat today, please post them in there. We're going to leave the chat function for chat only. So if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. And we're excited to get started. I can't wait to introduce you to who we have on board today. I'm just going to pull up all of our live streams right now, and we are live, people. Yeah. Awesome. So while we're waiting for everybody to come in, I am just going to give it just another minute or so. So we've got some people coming in. I don't know about you guys, but it's a really nice day here. We had snow 2 days ago, and that was not fun. So we're hoping that because, it's April, we're going to start getting some nice weather soon.
Where are you, Sarah?
I am in just outside of Toronto.
Okay. Wow. Snow. Okay.
Yeah. So it's been interesting. I think, we were supposed to only have 6 weeks left or something like that of winter, and we ended up with snow a couple days ago. So I don't know what to say to that. I really don't. I mean, I know Rob's in Texas, which is really nice, right? You're in t-shirts. I'm still in sweaters. I mean,
yeah.
All right, so I think we should just get started, and I've got all of our live streams up. So hello, everybody here on the Zoom meeting, as well as live with us on LinkedIn, Twitter. We're also live on YouTube, which is extremely exciting. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion today. I have an exclusive group of supply chain professionals joining me in this webinar, and we are excited to be live streaming across the Let's Talk Supply Chain and Procurement Foundry platforms, as well as the Mercado YouTube channel. My name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I am the host of Let's Talk Supply Chain podcast, blog, and YouTube, as well as the CEO of Ships. Today, I have some of my favorite people in the supply chain with me, and I cannot wait for you to meet them. They are not only changing the way we look at managing operations, but they are also helping lead the charge in how supply chains can change the global landscape. So the title of today's session is Do Good, Be Good, How to Leverage Tough Times to Create a Better Future. I love that. The team at Mercado came up with that. Supply chain collaboration is the future of business. And if anybody knows me, I love that as well. I always talk about how collaboration is the future of business, especially since it feels like we've all hit the pause button on everything as of late. It's up to us to be good and do better so that when the time comes to hit the play button, we're prepared. So with me today are Mercado CEO Robert Garrison, Public Habit founder Sydney Badger, and Mercado product lead Rebecca Rizzuti. So let's get to know them a little bit more. So why don't we go around the room, let us know who you are, what you do, and what has been a real eye-opener for you lately. So Rob, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having us. So first of all, I'm the CEO of Mercado, as Sarah mentioned. Mercado is a platform created for importers to help enable their goals. And what we see a lot is people looking to improve their social mission, improve their efficiency, or reduce their risk. So that's what we do for a living. My background is international supply chain. I've been doing this for a long time. I started in Chicago with an ocean carrier called American President Lines. I then flipped over to the importer side with Michael's Stores and Kmart up in Troy, Michigan. And then I spent the last part of my career with two large 3PLs, FedEx and UPS. So I'm definitely an international supply chain geek for sure. In terms of what's changed, Sarah, I hate to say it, but a lot of things are still the same, even though I've been doing this a long time. The ships still sail at the same knots, the trucks still drive the speed limit, and most of the origin processes are still analog, unfortunately. So I do see a big move afoot, but I can't wait, frankly. I've been waiting for a long time for this, Sarah.
Yeah, me too. And I can't wait to get more into the discussion. So Sydney, why don't we go to you next?
Sure. Thanks again for having me on as well. It's exciting to be here. I am the Public Habit co-founder. I am currently in Seattle. Usually I'm based in China, in Shenzhen, China, but things are a bit different right now. Public Habit is an e-commerce platform that is connecting customers directly with top-tier fashion factories. So we partner directly with factories to offer really high-quality essentials, and we basically work with them to ship directly from the source. We produce only what we make to minimize waste and reduce all of the overproduction that's fairly rampant in the fashion industry. And we were lucky enough to find Mercado less than a year ago, who've been a partner to help us kind of digitize what we're doing. My background's mostly been in retail. I actually came from Amazon, so I've worked between marketplaces and brands and trying to figure out the best of both worlds. There's a lot of opportunity there, of course. For me, especially being in the fashion industry, this pandemic is really laid bare the just true inefficiencies that are still rampant in this supply chain that Rob mentioned. So it's things that have kept me up at night for a long time that even customers are actually aware of right now. So I'm super excited about the change that is going to be forced upon many of these businesses and just the customer awareness that's happening.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about it on LinkedIn today. I've been a part of a few conversations already today talking about what that's going to look like, inventory, and everything in between. And we're going to get to your story because Rob and I both really love what you guys are doing over there, and we can't wait to share that with the rest of the audience. But before we do that, Rebecca, let's go to you. Who are you, and what's been a real eye opener for you?
Hi, Sydney. Thank you again for having us here. But as Rob mentioned, I am with Mercado now. I spent 20 years on the import side, mainly in retail. So as we've heard recently, all of the challenges that we're having as importers just to get our supply through has been something that we've faced for many, many years now. So from that aspect, I've been able to join as the product lead to help try and formulate the system to kind of meet the needs of our customers and try and solve some of those age-old problems that we've been strapped with. The same problems that we're seeing right now during this pandemic, we're starting to see that conversations around the supply chain are becoming mainstream that were never mentioned before, and you didn't hear about it in prime time until people started searching for their toilet paper and hand wipes. So we're really excited to have the attention and be able to use that to change the way that we do things going forward.
It's so funny because toilet paper, I feel like we talk about it almost daily for the last couple of months, and it's not something that I think we've ever really talked about before.
That's right. But we'll take any attention to improve upon the supply chain.
That's right. That's right. So just for the participants on Zoom, as well as the participants on live, just remember in Zoom, we're going to take your questions in the Q&A function, and on live, I'm going to be monitoring. I've got like 4 different screens. I wish you guys could all see this, but I'll be monitoring LinkedIn and Twitter for all of your questions there. So let's dive right in. I mean, the last 3 years have been really tough for importers. We have gone from trade wars to global tariffs, sourcing shifts, to ramped up government regulations, all alongside a massive increase in consumer consciousness. And now, of course, we're dealing with coronavirus. But yet there still remains an underlying issue with the way international supply chains are set up, even before you add on all the complexities we're seeing today. So Rob, I want to send this one over to you. How do you think all of the adversity supply chains have been facing the past 3 years will affect companies sourcing products overseas?
Yeah, so thanks there. First, I would say, I suspect actually it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I want to start there. And we're going to talk a little bit further, hopefully, about some of the solutions to this thing. So I hate to keep beating on the problems, but what Sarah said is right. All of those things over the last 3 years have been incredible. And it's what I call who moved my cheese. It's, for 20 years, things were fairly predictable and fairly stable. And then all of a sudden, as Sarah mentioned, just kind of all hell broke loose.
Yeah.
So that's sort of number one, is who moved my cheese. A couple other impacts I'm seeing really starting to come to the forefront. And Sarah mentioned it with toilet paper. There's a really big change in demand velocity. So up until maybe 5 years ago, it was pretty normal to receive stuff in a week or 2 weeks. And now it's abnormal not to receive it the same day. So demand velocity has really changed. And a lot of these products, as everybody on this call knows, are sourced in Asia. And so there's a real need to be able to tie that supply into that demand and keep up with that velocity. And the third thing, and you touched on it, Sarah, but it's a big deal for me to, and Sydney mentioned it as well, it's to see the change, the impact in consumer awareness, but also governmental awareness. So we're going to see, I think, some big changes in terms of consumers' expectations of how we behave, the end consumer, I mean, not the importer, as well as how the government behaves. It was very clear in this pandemic that there were some major shortfalls that need to be addressed. And I'm sure that the governments are going to take action to make sure that doesn't happen again. So those are the three things that I see in terms of impacts going forward that I think this audience needs to be thinking a lot about and putting plans in motion for.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point with consumer behavior. I was on a conversation yesterday and somebody was saying that people are getting even picky with the presentation of food that's being delivered to them. And, on one hand, so, somebody was saying that's going a little bit too far, but on the other hand, this really gives us a good place to start to really figure out what the consumers are really looking for, what they want to see, what their expectations are, especially in a time like this where everything's kind of going online, right? Because you can really only buy products online right now. You can't really buy bricks and mortar in some cases. So do you think that behaviors like this will continue to happen, especially given the current global situation that we're in, that's kind of heightening everything and putting supply chain on the forefront?
Yeah, so I like to say absolutely yes. The beatings will continue until supply chain morale improves,
Yeah.
for sure. So I think we have a responsibility now for all those reasons we mentioned, and so I want to talk about some of the things that I see trending as well. So one thing is this whole notion of the upside for an importer is upstream, and I think Sydney's going to talk a lot about that. Once something gets on a boat or a plane, there's nothing you can do to affect the outcome. And there's roughly 120 days, 90 days that happen before it gets on a boat or a plane. So what are we doing upstream? That's where we have the biggest leverage. So we at Mercado refer to that as the first mile of the supply chain, like the first 90 days. And so what are all the things that we can do there to affect change with the manufacturers, with the providers, with everybody to make sure we get different outcomes? So that's number one. Number two, what I'm seeing is, and it's kind of strange what I mentioned that not much has changed in this time, is we need to have a networked supplier base. We need to be able directly to plug into those suppliers, and I mean sort of meaningful connections, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. But so right now we're just peripherally touching the suppliers. It's mostly Excel and email, frankly, and there needs to be a direct connection, and we need things like profiles and so forth, and I'll talk about that later. Another thing I see is that we need to connect the supply to the demand. And so everybody who's looking at their sales also needs to see their products globally. And so I think there needs to be some plugging in. And then I think the other thing people are going to have to think a lot about is resiliency. And so as you looked at all these things that are happening and all the knockouts, we're talking about toilet paper now kind of jokingly, but in 4 months, you're going to see the impacts in like back to school, backpacks and jeans and all things. So we don't have a very resilient supply chain for all the reasons we mentioned. It's very fragile, actually. So I think that's another opportunity. And then in terms of efficiency, there's a lot of opportunities for us to get more efficient and do things smarter. Just like we've seen in this pandemic, people are changing behaviors. And we started looking at what we've changed to. It's kind of like, this makes a little more sense than the way we used to do it, actually. So I think you'll see a lot more action in that area, Sarah.
Yeah, well, and also we're seeing a pileup of spring inventory right now. I don't know about you guys, but I've been hearing about spring inventory piling up in containers because there's really nowhere to put it. And so I think, that's where the first mile is really going to become that much more critical as we look at, the sourcing and the purchasing and what we're going to do down the road to be able to mitigate some of this risk that is really coming up right now. And so, Rebecca, I want to bring you into the conversation because building off of Rob's point on the lack of resiliency and efficiency, how does the current buying process actually end up adding to the complexity that we're seeing in supply chains right now?
Sure. I mean, definitely, you don't hear a lot about what's happening behind the scenes. Most people are just, as you
Yeah.
said, expecting those products just to be there and show up on their doorstep in a box or just go to the shelf and pick it off. But people aren't realizing that the current manufacturing and buying process is especially complex for international. And when we say that, we're not always talking about it like it's impressive. We're just saying it's complex. And of course, some industries are worse than others, but mostly everybody is managing a portion of that purchasing process through some type of Excel document.
Ooh.
I mean, and these Excel files, I mean, they're just going back and forth via email between the buyers and the vendors multiple times before they're even finalized purchase orders. So when we talk about that first mile, before we even get to the point that we've actually agreed on something to buy, we've already denigrated our process to go back and forth on email. And the problem is that those buyers and vendors, they're having countless number of decisions going back and forth. And that's how we're managing it on Excel. It's ridiculous, it's complex, it's rigid. You can't manage that, and it's always going to have human error built into it. More importantly, I don't even know how you would scale it. It's just unsustainable. And as we talked about earlier, this is the digital age. It's time for us to get into it and stop operating the way we're operating.
Yeah, and you're really seeing that now. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of tech companies like Mercado right now, where, you know, a lot of people are coming to them at this moment because they've shelved some of those decisions previous to now. And now all of a sudden, you know, it's like, holy, we need to get on that train. We need to get on board. And I'm with you. Like, I don't even know how you manage all of that and keep on top of everything through Excel. I mean, I thought the days of Excel were kind
I'll
of
tell you
over. Okay.
firsthand, you don't. Things drop. But
Okay.
you'll be surprised how long you can keep it going.
Really, with Excel?
I mean, I came from Amazon, and even in Amazon, when we were placing buys, they were still in Excel. This is 5-6 years ago, but like, the stuff hasn't changed that much.
Don't worry, we won't tell anybody. Well, so I didn't think, you know, the days of Excel were over, but I thought they were kind of long behind us. But anyways, you know, the pandemic is really exposing technological gaps, like I just mentioned. You know, people are taking a look at their global supply chains, really from end to end, hopefully from a circular perspective. And we'll talk about that a little bit with Sydney in a bit. You know, so Rob, I'm going to send this over to you. What should executives focus on when it comes to technology as we move through COVID-19, but more importantly, after COVID-19?
Yeah, so thanks. And I think I say this a lot, but it bears repeating. I'd say before you think about technology, start with the process. There's a lot of things that are just bad processes. And if you have a bad process and you automate it, you just make bad things happen faster. So I'm not a big fan. And in fact, just recently spent some time with Public Habit, just taking a look at so we can re-examine their process and see if there's things that we can improve and then layer technology on. So step one, map the process. I think that's a big issue. But in terms of what we do with technology from our perspective, if you do nothing else, I would say to digitize your order. You know, the order is your instructions throughout that 90 days, and it should be followed, and it should be threaded through. And I call it the atomic purchase order, because all the details on that purchase order are what you expect, and they need to be threaded throughout the supply chain. And I'm going to tell you just a simple analogy with McDonald's related to that. But the third thing is, as I mentioned earlier, a meaningful connection to your suppliers and buyers so that you have the ability to connect to them in all ways. And so when we talk about personas, for example, you should have a complete profile of all of your supply base, and not just their names on a spreadsheet, but who are these people? How long have you worked with them? And who are the people that work there? What are their capacity constraints? All of that thing should be profiled. Same thing with people you're dealing with. What is their backgrounds and how long have they worked at that company? All of those kind of connections should be apparent and meaningful. And today they're not. So those are the three things I'd say. I want to try this quick analogy, Sarah, just bear with me for a second, to McDonald's. This drives me crazy when people talk about what's the deal with the ordering process. And so I say, if you walk into a fast food restaurant today and place your order, they put it into the computer, as you would expect, like we put a purchase order in a computer. And then it goes up onto a screen behind them for the workers to know exactly how many hamburgers to make and fries and so forth, right? Pretty simple and pretty straightforward. The
Yeah.
product comes out, they put it on a tray, you can examine it, and you can bring it to your table. Well, in the international purchasing world, it starts out in a computer, but then it turns into, WeChat and WhatsApp. And that goes on for 90 days, right?
Right.
And then to sort of add insult to injury, you can't just look at your product on the tray and then decide you want to take it to your table. Let's say McDonald's put it in a bag and sealed it shut and told you can't look at it till it gets home. That's
Right.
Because that's how it works today. So you need to have that sort of meaningful order connection and follow that thread through and include all the things that you expect, like ordering screens at McDonald's and digital connections and milestones. All the tools that you would sort of expect in modern technology should be available to an importer so they can monitor their order, keep it digital, and monitor it at an atomic level all the way through the process.
Yeah.
So you're talking about millions of dollars worth of inventory. I'm concerned about my hamburger and fries, let alone tens of millions of dollars of inventory. So it needs to be, I can use McDonald's. Imagine McDonald's would sell, like, instead of 1 billion hamburgers, they'd sell about 10,000 if they did it like international purchasing. So
that is a good point. And I really like the fact that you've put it into a perspective that we can all sort of resonate with. But there was a couple things that I want to hop on what you said, because I think, sorry, say that
doesn't
again.
speak too well about my eating.
Well, all good. I'm good. I mean, I eat McDonald's sometimes. But I want to hop on what you said previously was, number one, partner with your technology company, because at the end of the day, your processes, but you can only figure out how to turn them into a more efficient process through technology by partnering with you guys. Like, you guys need to come in and say, hey, this is what you're doing. This is what we can be doing better. This is how we can be more efficient. And then I really like the fact that you said, you used a marketing analogy by the buying personas. So usually we talk about buying personas in marketing, but now you're changing that out into a supplier persona, so that you really get to understand who it is that you're looking to work with, what kind of characteristics you want them to have, which is really going to help you, mitigate those risks in supply chain and be able to partner with a technology company to help you in that first mile. So I like that. I like that a lot. So now we're going to go to Sydney. We heard a little bit from Sydney earlier, but let's get the perspective from someone who is on the front lines, which is Sydney. So you have a global supply chain that spans several countries. Why is technology essential to a supply chain, especially in the period of time that we're living in right now?
Well, yeah, where to begin?
That is a loaded question, I think.
Yeah, well, I think it's very tangible for all of us right now. I mean, you think about the really essential businesses to us all, aside from obviously healthcare and what we all need to just survive. But you've got Amazon and Walmart kind of ruling the coop, having basically war profiteering right now because they have a service and an offering that people really need. Yeah. And they're only capable of doing what they're doing because they've got a digital supply chain. I mean, imagine having to try and get your essentials without leaving the house, without companies like Amazon in the picture. So I think it's obviously becoming forefront and center to really understand which are the companies that are capable of making our lives easier, making what we need available when we need them. I mean, as I'd mentioned at the beginning, I usually live in China. I'm based in Shenzhen, which is this like super high-tech, crazy city in China, if you're not familiar with it. And my entire life was basically optimized for a pandemic. I mean, it is optimized for a pandemic in China. I think it's about the only country that I'm aware of that was ready for something like this for our entire life. Move online. My food is delivered by a robot to my apartment. I can order a bikini and digital business cards to have them delivered within an hour to my apartment. Online education, entertainment, even healthcare. Like, it's all available through apps, through my phone. It's pretty crazy. I literally don't need to leave my apartment if I don't want to.
Right.
And that's just not where we are in the US yet. So I'm, personally very aware of this. When my co-founder and I were starting Public Habit, we'd had this experience at companies like Amazon, And then we'd also seen, I previously worked for a company like Ralph Lauren, which is a very old school traditional fashion retailer that was truly working in the Excel. I mean, I can't even get into the tools that thing. But,
oh, come on, tell us, Sydney. Everybody wants to know.
The only thing I can compare it to is like floppy disk land. Like it was like MS. I don't even know the language for it. It was like so 1972. But it worked for them for a while. So we were viscerally aware of how important managing a global supply chain digitally was going to be for us to build this business. I mean, our entire vision was connecting top tier global manufacturers directly with customers and closing that gap so that customers could really see and know and touch and feel and like really understand that their product is made by someone, even in a mass production facility in a 1,000-person factory. Like there's a human there that's still making your shirt, your sweater, whatever it is, and closing that gap is really what motivates us. And that vision could not come to life without a digital supply chain. Imagine we're trying to batch an order in Australia with a similar order in Kansas, and we have to route it to a factory in Shanghai that then needs to turn around that order within 5 days, send it to our logistics 3PL in Shenzhen and get that out to a customer without ideally an integrated tool like Mercado is helping us with to make that happen. We couldn't do it.
Yeah. It wouldn't be a very good global supply chain. It would actually probably take you 10 times as longer, or 10 times as long just to do it, I would imagine. And then you'd have some pitfalls and some gaps. So I want to let the audience know before we get to the next question, because I want to ask you kind of what technology looks like for you after coronavirus. I know you guys are really into sustainability. You guys are doing amazing things, trying to reduce waste within the retail supply chain. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how technology has really helped you to do that and really, go from end to end to circular? I think that that's an important topic right now. So I just want to throw that in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. And I don't know how familiar the audience is with specifically the fashion industry, but that has been kind of my obsession for a while. And the reality is we're making far more than we need. The amount of overproduction in the industry, because of a lot of these supply chain inefficiencies that we've been getting into, has created a giant global environmental problem. So, tangibly speaking, 1 in 3 items that are made are never even sold. So it's like 30% of clothing produced, which amounts to like over 50 billion garments every year. Wow. That does not find a customer. It's tagged, it's brand new, it's ready to go, and it's going to end up in a landfill or burned, just because of poor planning and this incredibly long, complex supply chain. The fashion industry typically starts about 18 months ahead of when a customer gets to actually see the product from a design and planning perspective. And in that time, all of these bad guesses, I mean, for all the AI out there, you can't have predicted a pandemic. You can't have predicted, I don't know, that like jelly shoes were going to come back. Like a lot of people didn't see that. So there's just a lot of bad guessing, unfortunately, that leads to really, really big problems. And for us at Public Habit, it was so obvious to us that you needed a demand-driven supply chain to really fix that core problem. I mean, there's so many things that you could tackle. There's so much toxic waste. There's so many bad things within the production practices within fashion, but we said, what's the one thing that we think will have the biggest impact? And it was tackling this overproduction and waste issue. And for us, that's really flipping the supply chain to be as demand driven as we can be.
I love that. And you guys are doing some amazing things. So before we move on, there is a question for you from the audience. How does Public Habit differentiate itself from, say, a Li & Fung or William E. Connor or even Sourcify, apart from the sustainability angle?
Oh, interesting. Well, we're not B2B, we're B2C. So, I mean, I think fundamentally we're a brand. Consumers can go to publichabit.com, search, we primarily offer cashmere and wool knits at the moment. So you can shop a cashmere sweater from us that's made on demand, branded Public Habit, and it arrives within 3 to 4 weeks. We are not a service at this point. We've definitely gotten that question several times, like, this is what brands need. Why aren't you a B2B solution for them? And we are really, really convinced that we want to bring customers along this journey about why we're doing it the way we're doing it. So that there's that question in that moment when we're asking them to wait an extra 3 weeks to receive something that we make on demand, that they understand why. Otherwise, this thing can't change.
Another question was that 50 billion garments that don't get purchased? Was that the number that you used?
Yeah, so there's, I think it was last year, there were 150 billion garments produced globally. And so I'm just using the kind of 30-ish%. And so assuming we've got probably more than 100. Oh, she's frozen on us. All right. So let's kind of move on from that one until we get. Oh, there she is. Sorry, you froze for a moment, Sydney. Oh, sorry.
Great. So one last question for you, because I know we wanted to talk about technology post-coronavirus. What does that look like? What's your strategy? I mean, a lot of things that we're looking at right now is kind of the unknown. So what are you doing to plan for that? And what's your technology strategy?
Oh, to be honest, it's not going to be hugely different than pre-coronavirus, because we'd already identified Mercado as a solution for helping us digitize our end-to-end processes, like primarily, as Rob mentioned, kind of that ordering process, to make sure that we can route customer orders really easily through to our factories and really have a good tracking mechanism to do that. As we mentioned, like, the reasons that so many brands are in trouble right now is that they had already planned, produced, and were ready to ship, or had already received goods through maybe fall. And the scary part is they're either canceling orders, delaying payments, all of which is just a horrendous impact on the factories partners that they work with. So I think the only thing that's really top of mind for us now is, how do we embed more transparent communication in our technology to communicate with our suppliers? Let's be honest, we're still on WeChat with them. That's still a communication tool that we need. But imagine our technology that would also have audit reports, feedback on audit reports embedded with our sales. We want our suppliers to know what we're selling. We want them to get customer feedback on what the products look like. So to me, I look at our suppliers as our production department, and we're the sales department. We need to be embedded in that way. And I really, really believe that the supply chain technology is going to need to evolve to a place where there's a lot more transparency and clear communication between supply and demand.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's going to be a driver on the circular side as well, right? Not just the end to end, but to really help us go circular. So, technology is majorly disrupting the supply chain. I mean, that's what we've just spoken to Sydney about, but so are consumers. And with everything happening around current events like we're going through right now, a spotlight is being placed on buying practices, which is what Rob and I kind of touched on at the beginning of this. So Rebecca, I want to ask you, as consumers are latching onto this information, they're hearing more about supply chain, do you think that companies face more or less scrutiny on their overseas buying practices?
I definitely think that the only answer we could even give you is always going to be more. Access to information, consumer awareness, their self-education, and then just the information that's available to them today that wasn't there necessarily even 1, 5, or even 10 years ago. It's always going to drive a consumer to want to know more about what is happening. Events like these, it's going to make it impossible for consumers who maybe were not paying attention to continue down that path. People are really realizing that there's so much manufactured that is is happening at imported from overseas. And this outbreak is just adding to that attention. So where you thought things were being produced here in another state or in your city, they're just out of stock now. And we're finding that we're not going to have access to those products for more than 30 days or so. As Cindy mentioned, Amazon is one of the heaviest suppliers of products now for us to just live our daily lives. And when you get on there, you're seeing things that are out for more than 30, 45 days. And they're even messaging that there's things that aren't even sure when they'll be back in stock. And that's not a dissimilar message to what we're seeing from Walmart and other big box retailers that are still open. So the buyers are really aware now that these items are coming from someplace really far away. And as we get further into this crisis, before we come out of it, we're going to start seeing the consequences of those decisions months ago. You know, what's going to start showing up? Is it the things that we need? Is it the things that we want? That scrutiny is going to get more as the consumer saying, well, who is really making all of these products for us? You know, where are they making it? And why are they the ones making it? Why are we taking so long to bounce back? I mean, that's been the argument that we've been seeing front of the news on PPE for weeks now. People are just surprised at the fact that we're just bringing in not just the product itself or possibly the components to finish those products here, even in the United States. So I do think that technology is going to be really important to these companies now, because if you don't have something that's transparent and that's digital, you're not going to be able to react. You're not going to be able to change your buying practices. You're not going to be able to understand what your consumers are demanding from you, because you're going to be spending so much time trying to understand what occurred to you 6 months ago, as opposed to planning for the next 6 months. And honestly, we're really not going to stop seeing responsible sourcing going away. That was always been a hot topic, and it's become more important to us now as we start looking at what we're going to be bringing in the next phase. So when we come back to work and we come back to really doing our full imports, our customers are going to be asking for answers as to what happened. And we're going to be looking at companies like Public Habit to change that and to kind of give us some answers as to how we can do this and be successful, and then also minimize the waste that we're bringing to our landfills.
Yeah, great point. I mean, overbuying, like I said, you know, we're seeing it now with all the spring inventory with nowhere for it to go. I mean, it's definitely something that, you know, we need to figure out moving forward. And so a lot of the conversations that I'm also seeing right now are about nearshoring. Everybody's saying, you know, are we going to be bringing manufacturing? I had a presentation with an economist last week, and he was like, globalization is not going anywhere. And so, Sydney, I want to throw this to you. Do you know, why don't importers like yourself just simply move production to North America? To, you know, what are you going to do? Are you going to diversify your manufacturing? Are you going to move some of it to North America? Are you going to keep it overseas but diversify across, you know, different continents or countries? You know, what are you going to do after this?
Yes, I get challenged on China almost daily. We would certainly get a lot less scrutiny if we were 100% made in USA. But beyond the obvious answer around costs that we're all aware of, there's a lot of reason for us to be starting in China. I mean, they're so far ahead of the game from a digital and from an advanced manufacturing standpoint to be able to do what we're trying to do. I mean, we're asking them to produce one-for-one orders in an efficient way that they can turn around in 3 to 5 business days and basically do the QA, QC that they need to do and ship it out to customers. The only reason they're able to do that is because they have so many more channels available to them already for reaching customers directly. So by that, I mean the complete explosion of marketplace and the domestic e-commerce in China has really, really turned these suppliers into sellers. They know how to operationalize their whole supply chain so that they can make more money by reaching customers more directly. And because of that, people like me are able to go in, learn from that, learn a tremendous amount from that about how they're able to do that, but really enable them to access customers overseas that they don't know how to target, don't know how to develop products for, but they've already got the rest of it down.
Right.
We would certainly, like I said, get less scrutiny. And unfortunately, I think it's a big problem that there's so much misinformation about the dirtiness of producing in China. We long-term absolutely want to diversify the supply chain. I mean, our goal is always to be looking for the best manufacturers globally, but we're starting with people who are really thinking about waste minimization. And right now that's in China. And our goal is to really do a lot of education about why China is a great place to be. The expertise and the skill is there, especially with the knit production that we do. And we've got a lot to learn from them.
Great. Well, so I am just to let the audience know, if you have any questions, make sure to put it in the Q&A in Zoom, or make sure to put it in the comments on our LinkedIn live pages. I've got another question for Rebecca and Rob, and then we're going to be getting to your questions because we have quite a few, but I didn't want to throw them in there too early. So Rebecca, since we're talking about production, Sydney was just talking about that. What is there anything that's going to change in the regulatory environment? Like, is there anything that we really need to take a look at or consider moving forward?
I think we're actually seeing quite a bit of that change over the last couple of years already. And I don't think that we're going to see that it's going to be changing. I mean, the government has continued to add or impose requirements on countries with whom we're doing business with. And those requirements are going much further to enforce compliance than they ever did before. The government's also taken punitive action against those countries that they feel are showing unfair trade practices or maybe not meeting up to the agreements that they have set already. So those additional requirements aren't going to make things easy for companies to do business the way that they've done in the past. They're going to have to look at what's going to change, what is going to have to be adjusted in their production or in their sourcing strategies to make sure that they are still able to meet the demands of their consumers in a compliant manner. So anybody who's going to be relying on manual processes or email communication, like we opened this conversation, they're going to be susceptible to that change in landscape more than ever. If a company is looking to adopt paperless and web-based environment where those orders can be managed and they can attach all of the financial, regulatory, and compliance documentation, they're going to be in the position to be successful and have a competitive advantage. That's really what everybody should be ready for, because as we've seen with the current administration, there is not a lot of time to necessarily react. People may think that 30, 60, 90 days is, but as Sydney and Rob have mentioned, we're looking at 90 to 180 days of planning before we even place an order, and months to a year in advance before we're actually making some decisions on how we're going to make those production lines operate and bring those products to market. So there is going to be continuous change, and after we come out of this current pandemic, we're going to actually see probably more questions being asked of some of the countries that we're doing business with and where we're actually operating.
Awesome. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this happens. I mean, take a look at what they did with tariffs, implementing it within how many days, and everybody sort of scrambling to figure that out. So Rob, before we get to the audience questions, one last question for you. You've got about 2 minutes because I want to leave about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So Rob, what about the importer themselves? What's going to change on their end? What do you see happening there?
Yeah, 2 minutes. VDA, I would say, just use that acronym. VDA, 3 minutes. Okay, so the first one, the V, visualization. I think you're going to see a lot more being done with technology on the front end, especially of the process, where you can do digital showrooms, digital design. The technology is there now where you can sort of be in the showroom without being there, even from 8,000 miles away. And I think that visualization will extend throughout the production process, where you'll actually be able to see what's being produced and do your quality inspections virtually. I think the second one, D, digitization, we've already talked about it from a benefits standpoint. There's a lot of efficiency gains. There's customs and regulatory gains. There's so many gains from digitization that we can talk about. And the last one, automation. When I talked earlier about map your process first and then put technology in, there's a lot of steps we're doing that should just plain be removed. There's no need to have the supplier produce documents, for example, that can be done electronically, and many examples like that. So let's look to take steps out of the process. One quick thing, Sarah, I know I've only got 1 minute left, but last fall I was in China, 9 buyers at a restaurant working for a Dallas retailer, having a good time. It was, a good event. But I started to think to myself, post-pandemic, would they still do that, right? Each of those trips probably cost $1,000, I would say. So it's expensive, but also it's time consuming, it's risky. And what we've seen with this pandemic is with VDA, there's so many things now that we can look to do differently than we've done them in the past. So just using that one example of 9 buyers in China and expanding that to everything else we talked about, I think VDA is the future. So visualization, digitization, and automation.
I think you're right. I saw a post today on LinkedIn that talked about the percentage of people that want to be traveling or in big groups. So, like there was percentages for green and percentages for red, and the percentages in red were really large. Like people are not looking to be, they want to be changing. They want to be going to virtual, and they want to be able to do things virtually. And I think you're right, you know, with VR and AR and everything that's coming out, I think there's a really, really big opportunity and possibility there. So one of the questions is for you, Rob. Does Mercado perform on-site quality inspection services like SGS or an Intertech? How does Mercado impact the outcome during the first mile of the supply chain? And thank you for that question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Similar to what Sydney said, we're not a service provider. We're a technology company through and through. So the way that we manage that, Sarah, is we partner with companies like SGS or Quima, any inspection company, really. Our goal is to network the entire supply chain. So we talked a lot about suppliers and providers. By providers, I don't just mean freight forwarders and carriers. I also mean packaging companies and inspection companies and trucking companies. Really, the goal is to connect that. So just real quick on that point, Sarah, you can imagine that if you need an inspection done in our system, we could send that call out to the inspection company digitally to say, here's when the inspection needs to be performed with instructions embedded. The inspection company could perform that inspection and then upload the inspection results back into the platform. The client would get a notification from us saying your inspection is complete, and you can click on the link to see your inspection report. So just one example of, you know, we're not going to look to solve all the service problems. We want to connect all the people so that all those things are done digitally versus the current process, which is really cumbersome. So that's the way we look at that.
Connecting all the dots and collaboration. I mean, it's one reason why I really like Mercado. So Neil Dolinger says, Sydney, before COVID-19, did you see many of your Chinese manufacturers move their production facilities to Southeast Asia or even Africa? If yes, do you think this will ramp up or slow down post-COVID-19?
For my sector specifically, no. Because of the domestic demand, like I'd mentioned, the factories that we're partnering with are the ones that are really looking to optimize for reaching customers directly. So the Chinese domestic market is probably still the strongest in the world right now, is definitely still the strongest in the world. So they have no plans to move. And so I really can't speak to that trend. I know that Vietnam's been a big, you know, I think the majority of all apparel factories in Vietnam are Chinese owned. And I imagine that will still continue to happen because the expertise and the experience is still coming out of China largely to scale those kinds of operations.
Awesome. So another question that we have is about demand and forecasting. How do we improve demand signals and forecasting? I don't know who wants to take that. Maybe Rob?
Well, I think maybe, Sydney, if you don't mind, since it's demand signals, I can tell you how we respond to it technically, but you're on the front lines of that, Sydney, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, I don't consider a demand signal until there's a sale. We've looked to de-risk our supply chain as much as we possibly can. I think I've just seen too many examples of the guessing going wrong. However much you can possibly know, and however smart you can be and what tools you can leverage. That being said, I think there's some really great ways of being able to test lightly without having to produce. So for us, that means pre-orders. That really means getting a sample in motion, getting in front of customers, small sets of customers to get feedback. And you can get signals with social media within a couple of hours to know whether that's something that's worth bringing to market. So that I think is going to be more and more common to see, especially with the influencer age of how people are leveraging influencers to test new ideas and concepts. I think that will continue to be an important part of demand planning, to be honest. Get it live.
Yeah, good
So if
point.
I could
Yeah,
just-
Rob. Mhm.
I actually wrote down what Sydney said because I love the way she described it. Is, she's looking at herself as the sales and marketing department, and she's looking at her suppliers as the production department, and she's completely connecting those two. So the demand signals are coming from your sales and marketing department, however that works, in their case, extremely efficiently. And it needs to be translated directly to the production department so that they match. And that's really on the normal supply chain beyond Public Habit, which has a great model. That's really where the disconnect is that those demand signals are not tightly tied to the production department. I'm going to keep using that word.
Right.
And so there's just not only the inefficiency that Sydney talks about, is that we can't know what's going to happen in the future, but then there's all of the things that change in the meantime. On average, there's 7 changes per order on every single order. So it's super complicated. The two need to be inexplicably tied.
That's really interesting and kind of crazy, actually. So, Pratim over on LinkedIn says, are you expecting the buying practices to change? Have companies started looking for alternate suppliers? That kind of goes back to the diversifying manufacturing question. I don't know who wants to take that, maybe Sydney or Rebecca?
I think, Sydney, I can just kind of show what we've seen in the market, and then I'll kick it over to you. But what we've seen is a lot of those decisions on where they're going to be sourcing and what the practices are taking are being driven by those 2 points that we made. It's going to be the consumer, and it's going to be regulatory change or impact. And even before COVID-19, we started seeing people diversify their supply chain significantly to get out of China, mainly because they were being targeted with the 301. Even after that, we started hearing discussions, obviously, for France and technology. So we do expect to see people starting to diversify just to protect their supply chains in some sense. But the concern is as you break apart your supply chain as to whether or not you're able to look at all of the streams that you have in play to see if you're ordering appropriately, or are you going to find yourself in a position that you're overbuying again, or that you're sourcing the wrong items, or that they're not going to align with what you're expecting at the end. And companies that aren't necessarily in a place that they can merge those 3 streams are going to have challenges. But I do think people were starting to, in essence, overbuy immediately once 301 came into place, and they started seeing the impacts of the pandemic move across Asia and Europe before we even started having the first cases here. And I do think that we may still continue to see that as people are concerned that they could have disruption and not be able to recover in one region or another. I'm not sure, Sydney, if you have something else to add to that.
No, I think from a diversification, I think we've been seeing it for several years. I mean, pre-tariffs even as well. The only thing I'd add to that, and we're all aware, of course, I'm more familiar with textile manufacturing, but if I move my cut and sew finished production to North Carolina, that'd be great from a carbon impact. And we do think about that because we're measuring that. But I'm still going to get raw materials from China because the cashmere is the best in China. So as I think about the components and the pieces that you need to assemble supply chain, I'd still much prefer to localize that as much as possible. So I want my finished production to be as close as possible to my raw materials. And we'll continue to do that.
Yeah, Rob?
Yeah, I could just add one comment, actually 2. One is Rebecca touched on it with resiliency. There are people who are, solely in China and had problems, different issues than Sydney completely, and were stuck. So they're gonna have to look at it from a resiliency standpoint. But the point that Sydney mentioned is really a big one. A lot of people, when I talk about connecting networks, I'm not just talking about the tier 1 suppliers. There's tier 2 suppliers and tier 3 suppliers, and it's all connected. I saw a chart recently on how many suppliers come together to produce an Apple iPhone in China. Those products come from 13 different countries, including the US. And then they all have to be staged and assembled. And so the complexity of these supply chains is massive. And so it's not as just simple as moving your tier 1 supplier somewhere. It's, do the tier 1 suppliers have access to the same type and quality of tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers that they're enjoying today? So even if it's red yarn, I've still got to have a red ink supplier, and I've got to make sure they're close by, they've got plenty of supply and so forth. So it gets pretty complex. So I think when we look at resilience, customers are going to have to start mapping out their entire supply chain, which is very difficult to do manually. When you start to look at where do you have products and where do you have production and tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, it goes back again to digitalization. If you had all of that information in your database and you started connecting to all those tier 2 and 3 suppliers as well, you can make decisions much more proactively.
Great. So we've got time for one more question, and then I've got a question for the three of you before we go. So Rob, are suppliers expected to pay a fee to access the Mercado platform, or does the buyer assume that responsibility to foster collaboration?
I'm going to answer it this way. We do charge the buyer, not the supplier. And we've also given a lot of care to, why is that important? It's important because we know we've got to connect the network, and we know it's important. It's impossible if the buyers can't connect to the supplier. So we've given a lot of care to how to make it easier for the supplier. So we do native language translation. It's free to them. We take some work away from them. There's no data keying. And so for us, it's all about enabling this network, and we had to make that frictionless. So the value proposition goes to the buyer. And so that's where the charge goes. And we make it easy for the supplier to want to connect to the network. It actually makes them more efficient as well.
Awesome. Great. So before we go, I want to ask all three of you, what is one takeaway we can leave the audience with today? How can we change the world? I'll start with Rebecca.
Thank you. Well, I would say for sure in the current environment that we're in, coronavirus has definitely shifted everything into a clear light for us and everybody who's watching this unfold real time. And one of the takeaways I would say is for those who are looking to evaluate their supply chains and maybe look at changing the way that they're sourcing and their models is to understand that we have the tools now. We didn't have these tools before. So we talk about Excel and email as if, we can't let them go, but the reality is that we can. And the ability to use some of these more sophisticated tools to improve our first mile of importing and help those companies source and make better decisions on how to review their supply chains and do responsible sourcing is really huge. And I do think that we should take the time to look at that and bring that up to our organizations so that they can understand that we don't have to manage in this manner. So it's really exciting and motivating that we're moving in this direction. And it's an unfortunate time that we're getting the visibility because of what's happening, but we shouldn't waste it. We should look at making things better.
I love that. Love that. Okay, Sydney, what's the one takeaway?
Yeah, kudos to that, Rebecca. The thing that I think a lot about that makes me very optimistic is we are a lot more alike than we are different. And there's nothing like a global pandemic to really neutralize the landscape. This thing doesn't pick sides, countries, race, whatever you name it. And that to me means more collaboration across the board. Practically speaking, the thing that gets me really excited is shifting these ridiculous power imbalances that have existed in the traditional supplier-buyer landscape. It's frankly disgusting what brands and retailers have been able to get away with. And it's got to be looked as a long-term relationship. So my hope is that collaboration between buyer and supplier and that transparency and that communication between them through to the end customer is completely transformed by an experience by this, because you can't do it without one or the other. And the customer cares now.
Awesome. Rob, real quick, what's your one takeaway?
I always get 2 minutes. Go to me first next time. No, for me, it's simple. It's we started this podcast with, webcast, sorry. It's do good, be good. And so we started this business, we're business people, right? We started it to improve efficiency and resilience. That was certainly our intent. But I've been to 37 countries. I've been all around the world, and I've seen a lot of great things. It's been a really amazing career, but it's also exposed me to a lot of things that I didn't like. And so we call it shining bright lights in dark corners. So of the 3 things that we do, enabling somebody's social mission, and this is why we love Sydney and Public Habit so much, that's the most thing for me personally. That's the thing that I care the most about. So I think we can do good, efficiency, resilience, all of that stuff, but we can also be good. And these bright lights and dark corners are going to help us do that as well. So that's my
Love
My
that. So
reason.
to the audience, what does your supply chain technology strategy look like? You know, especially in the first mile, are there areas that you could benefit from automating? I'm sure right now everyone is seeing gaps, and it's the ones that will fill those gaps ASAP that will come out on top. Today we have heard from Mercado, who can help with that, and also from an online retailer already benefiting from their relationship with Mercado and ready to take on the world. If you would like to learn more or meet with Mercado, you can do that within the Procurement Foundry as long as you're a member, or you can visit them at mercadolabs.com. Plus, Mercado will be a featured startup in our upcoming startup showcase that will be happening June 25th in our one-day virtual supply chain conference open to members of Procurement Foundry as well as the rest of the supply chain community. Thank you, Rob, Sydney, Rebecca, for joining us today. Thank you to everybody in the audience on Zoom, and thanks to everybody live out there on the Ethernet too.
Thanks for having us, Sarah.
Thank you.